We're on DAF Yud Aleph Amud Aleph today. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. And today's DAF is a little bit, at least for me personally, it's complicated because anytime we talk about Fri Jun, transferring Kedusha from one item to another, I get a little bit confused. But we'll try our best. We're on the second line of the DAF, Amar Rabbi Chanina. And this Gemara is going back on the discussion we had yesterday. There was a machlokes as to who funded the construction of these ramps or bridges that were made for the Parah Aduma and for the Seir LaAzazel. One opinion is that this came from the Shiori Halishka, from the leftover coins that were in the chamber. And the other opinion was that it was the Kohen Gadol himself that funded it. So the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Chanina, Shachatzis Gedalia Haisa Bivnei Kohanim Gedolim, that this was an act of great hubris or arrogance on the part of the sons of the Kohanim Gedolim, who constructed these ramps every time. Sheyoser mishishim ki korei zahav hayu motziin ba, shahaya kibsha shel para omed, v'lo haya echad mehen motzi paraso b'kibsho shel chavero. He says that each time, he says more than 60 talents of gold were expended for this ramp or this bridge that was constructed for the Parah Aduma, to get it from one place to the other to avoid it coming in contact with any tumah. And every time that there was a new Parah Aduma, they would dismantle the old ramp and build a new one. And it was a huge expenditure. Elasosra ubona oso mishalo. Each Kohen Gadol that had the Zechus of having a Parah Aduma in his generation would dismantle the old ramp and build a new one for 60 talents of gold. What a huge expense. So the Gemara says this was an act of hubris on behalf of the Kohen Gadol. So Hesav Rabbi Ula Kome Rabbi Mana. So Rabbi Ula challenges this with the following brisa. It says, V'hatzmi Shimon Hatzadik Shtei Paros Asa Lo Bekevesh Hotzi Yazu Hotzi Yazu. So there's a brisa that says that Shimon Hatzadik, the most righteous Kohen Gadol of the entire Second Temple era, that he was zoche to have two Parah Adumas during his reign, during his period of when he was the Kohen Gadol. And he therefore constructed two separate ramps, each one different. He did not allow one cow to go on the same ramp as the other cow. So Islach Lameimar Shimon Hatzadik Shachatzaya. So is it possible to suggest that Shimon Hatzadik had hubris? That he was a tzaddik. Why I think he was called Shimon Hatzadik, right? This can't be because he was an arrogant person. So my kedon. So therefore, what's the alternative? It's got nothing to do with hubris, but rather because al shem maila hi bepara silsul hi bepara. That it was really because of creating extra derech eretz in honor for the Parah Aduma that they did this unique ramp for each para. It had nothing to do with the hubris of the Kohen, that he should be able to say, I built it, but rather it was a special kavod to the Parah Aduma.
Why would the Kohen Gadol have to build it?
That's a good question. It seems from this Gemara that it's considered to be a zechus, that during when you're the Kohen Gadol, in my generation, they found a Parah Aduma. It was very rare to find a Parah Aduma, so you had to, the Kohen Gadol is the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, so it's like in his chus that they found the Parah Aduma.
Sorry, only one bridge. No more bridges. Which kind of bridge around?
No, they dismantled it and then they rebuilt it. Every time there was a new Parah Aduma, they tore it down and they built another one. They wouldn't use the same one. Tani zizan uksalim hayotzim mikanu mikan kedei shelo yetzu v'yotzitzu hakohanim v'yitamau. The brisa now says that there were these barricades that were created around on either side of the ramp, and the reason why they did this was in order that the kohanim should not bend over. And actually, the way the Korban Ha'eda understands it. Let me just see where the where the Korban Ha'eda says this. He says Hayosim mikevesh apar kedeshlo yavou kohanim v'yatzitzu v'yavou liga ba'uskim b'hapara v'yatamu osan. The Korban Ha'eda learns that it's got to do with not the Kohanim who are dealing with the Parah Aduma, but other Kohanim would come, potentially, and want to try and look at what's going on during this processional of where the Parah is being led to where it's eventually going to be shechted and burned. And the fear is that maybe these other onlookers would touch the paradum and one of them would be tamei. So they made these barricades, like protruding rock that would stick out of the sides of the ramp to prevent people from coming too close. Okay, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein Mistakrin Chulei. Now let's go back to our Mishnah. We saw a number of opinions in our Mishnah as to what they did with the surplus of the Lishka. What did they do with it? What did they do with those extra coins? So one opinion was of Rabbi Yishmael, and he said, well, invest it in consumable goods, sell the goods, and the Beis HaMikdash will make a profit. And Rabbi Akiva said, you don't do that. You don't do that with mammon of hektish, and you don't do that with money of aniyim. And we had said yesterday that that it's not derech eretz, and you don't want to take risks with the expenses of either hektish and the aniyim and the poor. And that was Rabbi Akiva's position.
I just want to clarify again. So the money they're using is just regular donations. We're not talking about shkolim.
No, these are the shiori halishka. The shiori halishka is the leftover coins from the machatzis SHEK. So ela imratza yia hefset shalo v'yaschar lahektish. So the Gemara basically says that even Rabbi Akiva agrees that if one of the treasurers of the Beis HaMikdash says, I wish to invest the money, as long as he's willing to take responsibility that if there's any loss, he'll absorb the loss, then it's mutter for him to do the investment. And kahada, then it would be mutter. Kahada bar zemina ispaked gabe midal diyasmin asa v'shala Rebbe Mana. There was one such a case where there was a certain sage named Bar Zemina, a man named Bar Zemina, and he was entrusted with the estate of some orphans, and he came to ask Rebbe Mana, would it be okay for me to invest their money so that I can grow their estate, so that they can have more money? So Amar Lei in boys diha hafsada didach ve'agra detar vaychon shari. So he said to him, as long as you're willing to absorb any loss and make sure that the estate remains intact, if you do that, then it's permitted for you to invest it, and you can even take half of the profits as compensation for the time for your investment. Gee, that would be a great investment banker. If you could find an investment banker that's willing to take your money and guarantee any losses, and just
as long as he's not made of,
and guaranteeing the principal. Yeah, so that's pretty good. Okay, Rabbi Chia bar Ada ispakid gabe midal diyasmin va'avid kain. So Rabbi Chia did that very thing. He also was entrusted with the estate of Yisomim, and he did the very same thing. He invested it and guaranteed the principal. Okay, Mosar Peros. Now, if you remember from yesterday, I told you that we would explain in the Gemara what Mosar Peros was. Mosar Peros, there was a three-way machlokes in the Mishnah, where the question was, what do you do with Mosar Peros, with surplus Peros? Now, what is surplus Peros? What Peros are we talking about? Peros could mean either fruit, it can mean produce, it can mean dividends. So what exactly does it mean? Rabbi Yishmael had said that it goes for the Kayetz HaMizbeach, it goes for the Kitz HaMizbeach, it goes for anytime there's downtime, you use those surplus funds and you purchase animals to bring as Nedava Olas on the Mizbeach. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chananya Skan HaKohanim ignored the discussion of Mosar Peros, and they didn't talk about it at all. And the Mishnah even says that Zevezel lo hayu modim beperos. They didn't even acknowledge that there was anything to do with those Mosar Peros. So the question is, what is Mosar Peros? What is these leftover Peros? So Masnisin de Rebbe Yishmael. So the Gemara says that the Mishnah goes according to Rebbe Yishmael, who subscribes to this idea of Mosar Peros. The Rebbe Chia bar Yosef Pasar Masnisa Mosar Peros Schar Lehektish, that he explained that what is Mosar Peros? Mosar Peros is exactly that discussion that was in the previous line of the Mishnah, which was that what do you do with surplus machatzisa shekels? According to Rebbe Yishmael, you're allowed to invest them in consumable goods and sell them. So the proceeds that you raise from turning the Beis HaMikdash into a grocery store, those proceeds are called Mosar Peros. In other words, those are the dividends from the investment that the Beis HaMikdash makes. Rabbi Shmuel says it's permitted, Rabbi Akiva says it's not permitted. So the Mishnah that talks about Mosar Peros is going like Rabbi Yishmael.
What happened to the extra green apples upstairs?
That's a good question. I don't know. They must have taken them home with them. Okay.
Rabbi Akiva also said you could do it if he guarantees.
Well, that's the Gemara. But the point is that the Mishnah is talking about unconditionally, even if you don't guarantee it. So therefore, that's why there's only Rabbi Yishmael is consistent with his previous statement that he says you can invest. So it's the same Rabbi Yishmael who says that if you have surplus from those proceeds, then it goes for the Kitz HaMizbeach. Mosar Nesachim Zu Sa'a Revius. Now, there was another thing that our Mishnah talked about, which is surplus Nesachim. Now, Nesachim means any kind of accessory sacrificial item, which is wine, oil, and flour. In other words, any non-animal sacrificial item is called nesachim. It's usually, it comes as an accessory to an animal sacrifice. Now, when we talk about surplus nesachim, what do we mean? So there's another discussion in another Gemara, which is as follows. Let's say you have a merchant, and he guarantees to provide nesachim to the temple at a certain price. He says, I will provide you 4 sa'as for 1 selah. Like, let's say 4 pounds for $1. Okay? And then all of a sudden, the price of these goods goes up. So now you can only get 3 pounds for $1. So the halacha is that the Beis HaMikdash wins in that situation, and the merchant has to keep his original price. That's right. But the point is that the Beis HaMikdash always gets the advantage. And that's the price you have to pay if you're willing to do business with the temple. Right? You want to do business with the temple, you want to get the Zechus of getting the temple's business, you've got to be able to guarantee your price even if the price goes up. Which is a cautionary tale, by the way, for anyone, any vendor who wants to do business with a synagogue has to have the same attitude. It's a Zechus for me to do business with the synagogue. I can't put it on camera, but we had a situation where there was a vendor. We asked the vendor to give us a better price, and he schlepped us along, so we found a different vendor. The guy comes to us with tainas, I've been giving you business for da-da-da. What is this? You think we're doing you a favor by giving you the business? When it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, you got to give the Beis HaMikdash the best price. If you're not willing to work hard in order to give the temple the business, the temple will go elsewhere. You should consider it a privilege to do business with the temple. Anyway, soapbox down. Let's go on. Okay.
It's not to do business with you anyway.
That's right. No, I'm saying this guy came with us with tinus. He says, "I'm a Jew. You've been doing business with me. You have to do business with a Jew." Yeah. So because we gave the business to the person who gave us the best price, so we said to him, "What are you talking about? It's your responsibility to get the best price for the Beis HaMikdash." And if you're not willing to do that, so then we're going to take our business elsewhere. You have more responsibilities to us than we have responsibilities to you. We're dealing with mammon hektish here, with money that's people that sanctify for holy purposes. We can't play games. Okay. Anyway, so let's go on. So that's when we talk about surplus. Basically, the Beis HaMikdash has profited from the futures price rising. So they gain a surplus of goods as a result of the fact that the prices have gone up. So therefore, they're able to make more money when they sell those items. They make a profit because they were able to buy it at a lower cost, and then they sell it at a higher cost to the people who need to bring these libations. So therefore, that's what is called Mosar Nesachim. And that also was addressed to our mission. There was a machlokes, whether Mosar Nesachim goes to the purchase of klei shares, of ministering vessels, or whether it goes to the Kitz HaMizbeach. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan Pasar Masnisa, Mosar Peiros Zusa Aravias, Mosar Nesachim Lebeirutzin. So Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rav Chia Bar Yosef, because remember, Rav Chia Bar Yosef said the translation of Mosar Peiros is, like Rabbi Yishmael says, when you turn the Beis HaMikdash into a grocery, the proceeds from the grocery sales. And Mosar Nesachim is when the futures issue, when the Beis HaMikdash makes a profit from that. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Mosar Peiros means making a profit from futures, and Mosar Nesachim is a different surplus. The Beis HaMikdash also wins when it comes to measurements. When you want to do business with the Beis HaMikdash offers orders from a merchant they order 10 pounds of flour, you have to sell the 10 pounds in heaping measure, which means the measurements have to be heaping measures. When the Beis HaMikdash sells that flour to the bringer of a korban, they sell it in level measures. So the Beis HaMikdash ends up with a surplus of libation materials, a surplus of flour, a surplus of oil, because they are always given a little bit more than what they distribute. So from that's what's called Mosar Nesachim, and that's the issue of what the definition of Mosar Nesachim is. So now the Gemara says, "V'lesle l'Rebbi Chia bar Yosef leBeirutzin." So the Gemara's question is, why doesn't, according to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, the Mishnah doesn't address this issue of Beirutzin, of overflowing measurements or heaping measurements? So Amar Rabbi Chizkiya madenafal l'saravias nafal leBeirutzin, and Rabbi Chizkiya basically answers that what Rabbi Chia bar Yosef had defined as the futures profit, that Beirutzin is also subsumed under that. In other words, the words Mosar Nesachim not only includes the futures profits, but also includes the heaping measure profits. Now, al daite de Rabbi Chia bar Yosef nicha, ein mistraken b'shal hektish, aflo b'shal aniyim, lefichach zeh vazeh lo hayamodim b'peiros. He says, it works out well according to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, because he learns that Mosar Peiros means the proceeds from the grocery sales of the Beis HaMikdash. And that would explain why Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chananya Skana Kohanim did not acknowledge that there is such a surplus, because they held that the Beis HaMikdash should not get into the grocery business, right? That would explain the machlokes. However, al daiti de Rabbi Yochanan kasha. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's shver, it's difficult, because why? According to Rabbi Yochanan's definition of Mosar Peiros, which means the profit that the Beis HaMikdash gets from futures, so v'hataninan amdu migimel yisapek midalid. Because there's a Beferish Brisa that says, or a Mishnah that says, that if the price goes up, the merchant still has to make good on his original price. So then why does the Mishnah say that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chananya don't acknowledge that such a surplus exists? The surplus does exist. That seems to be according to everyone. So why didn't they acknowledge that such a surplus exists? The Gemara answers, Lo hayamodim bepeiros bekayetz lamizbeach, aval modim hayu b'chlei sharis. No, you're making a mistake. When it says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chananya didn't acknowledge that surplus, it's not that they didn't acknowledge that it exists. Of course that surplus exists, because everyone agrees to that. What they weren't acknowledging is that the proceeds of that surplus go to the Kayetz HaMizbeach, go to bringing karbanos when there's downtime on the altar. They did acknowledge that such a surplus exists, but they held that the proceeds of that surplus goes to the purchase of klei sharis. That's the machlokes. Now, ad kedon beirutze tzibor va'afilu beirutze yachid. So the Gemara says, I can understand you're talking about a surplus of flour, of oil, of wine that is used by the tzibor. In other words, it's one thing to say that if we have a yield of extra flour and oil and so forth from stuff that was donated for the purpose of the tzibor, or given or purchased for the purpose of the tzibor, then I can understand how we can use those proceeds to purchase klei shares. However, but beirutze yachid, v'lo nimsu klei shares boin mishal yachid. So he says, this is the question. The Gemara says, but how could you tell me that the proceeds of the beirutzin, of the overflowing measures, would go for the purchase of klei shares if these overflowing measures were extracted from individuals who had used these materials or had left over these materials as surplus? I mean, after all, if the Beis HaMikdash was purchasing them and selling them to individuals and they ended up with a surplus, how could you take an individual's flour and use it to purchase klei sharis? You can't purchase klei sharis from individual donations. It has to belong to the tzibor. Gahada detaninan. So the Gemara answers, Isha sha'asasa kisonas livna kisher v'vashetam sirena letzibor. So the Gemara says it works out the way we learned yesterday, that the mother of the Kohen Gadol, if she wanted to, could sew her son's tunic, right, provided that she donates it first to the tzibor. So too, they would make a tanai with all individuals who had leftover flour, and they would say, if you want, we assume that any leftover surplus flour that you have from your korban will be donated to the tzibor, and that way we can use it for the klei shares. Now, ad kedon beirut selach, va'afilu beirut yavesh. So the Gemara now asks the question. Up until now, there's an assumption that the libation surplus would certainly address liquid libations that are surplus items. But does that also include beirut yavesh? Does it also include dry surplus items? Now, why would I think that there's a difference between fluid surplus versus dry surplus? The answer is, as the Korban Ha'ida explains, that when you have a surplus of liquid, the liquid was poured into a kli shares, was poured into a ministering vessel, it overflows, and that surplus, at least at some point, had entered into a kli shares, and therefore it has the sufficient sanctity to be used either for the purchase of other kli shares or for the kayetz hamizbeach. But if something was never sanctified in a kli shares, can we say that it has sufficient sanctity to be automatically converted for these holy things? Dry items like flour, if there's surplus, then it means that it was a heaping measure that stayed outside of the kli shares. It stayed outside. It was above the kli. So since it was never sanctified inside the walls of the kli shares, maybe it doesn't have sufficient sanctity to be used for those holy purposes.
But the liquid might have also just stayed above the rim and just spilled over.
Yeah, I guess that's that small amount of surface tension the Gemara doesn't take into account. There's an assumption that it was poured in and then it flowed over. So so the Gemara's question is, does it apply to dry heaping measures as well? And so the Gemara answers, Ki hahi detaninan taman. Well, we can prove it from the following brisa. Hanasachim shekadshu bekli v'nimtza hazevach pasol, that if you have libation materials, nesachim materials, that were sanctified in a vessel, and then it turns out that the carbon that they're supposed to be accompanying, the animal carbon that's supposed to be accompanying, turns out to be non-usable, im yesham zevach acher yikravu imo. If yikarvu imo, if there is another animal that can be brought of the same kind that can be accompanied with these libations, so then that's what you should do. V'im lav lanu yufsulu belina. But if not, then if these things were allowed to lay out overnight without being brought, then they become pasul. There's two different ways of learning this Gemara. I'm going to learn like the Gra and like other Meforshim who say that we want to prove from this, since the Brisa does not differentiate between dry measure and wet measure, that under all circumstances the flour becomes sanctified even if it never actually entered into the walls of the vessel. The very fact that it's part of a grouping of particles that were in toto resting inside a vessel, we view even the stuff that's above the rim to be considered to be inside and sanctified by the kli shares. Let's take a now look at the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Mosar ha-ketoris maha yu osin ba. What did they do with the leftover ketoris? Now, let's just clarify. Ketoris, like many other materials that are used for sacrificial purposes, needs to be purchased every year from the new shkalim. If you have ketoris at the end of Adar, that ketoris is left over and was purchased from last year's shkalim, so you have to do something with it. You can't just roll it over into next year's. It's got because this next year's ketoris has to be purchased from the new shkalim. So what do you do with it? It's very expensive, of course. So we have to figure out a way to recycle it. So mafrishin mimena schar ha'umnin umechalin osa al mos ha'umnin. So what we do is as follows: we take the money from the lishka to pay the artisans who are in charge of construction projects in the Beis HaMikdash that are allowed to be compensated for by the lishka, and then we take that money and we cause the kedusha of the ketores to transfer onto that money. Okay, so we desanctify the ketores by taking its kedusha and passing it on to those coins. And then v'nostim osalu umnan bischaram, and then we give the ketores as compensation to those artisans for their work. And then v'chozin v'lochin osam mitruma chadasha, and then we take the coins from the new truma salishka, from the new shkalim, and we purchase the ketores back from them. In this way, the ketores now has been re-sanctified, but with the sanctity of the new shkalim, not with the sanctity of the old shkalim. Now the question you could ask yourself is, why don't we just desanctify the Ketoris without giving it to the Umnin, without giving it to the artisans. It seems that in order to be able to create a smooth transition from last year to this year, it also has to change hands. It has to leave the possession of Hektish first, and then re-enter the possession of Hektish with the New Year's coins. That seems to be the way the Mishnah is explaining it. Now, furthermore, the Mishnah says, "V'imba chadash bizmano lo chinosa mitruma chadash v'im lav min hayashana." Then the Mishnah says an interesting thing. It says, after you've given the Ketoris to the Umnin, if you have taka new shekels to give them, because this has been done, and it's after Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and we have a supply of new shekels, so then you taka give them the new shekels, and you cause the sanctity of those new shekels to go onto the Ketoris, and these shekels are desanctified, and they come therefore to the artisans. But let's say the artisans present you with their invoice before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and you don't have any new shekels yet. So because they need to be paid in a timely fashion, then you have no choice. You have to purchase back the Ketoris even with the old shekels. And essentially you haven't been able to accomplish your objective. And as someone explained to me from the art scroll, I think they were reading it, what you learn from this latter part of the Mishnah is that no matter how compelling your reason is for delaying payment to an uman, to an artisan who's done work for you, right? Even though the base of English has justification by saying, just wait a few days, we need to get in the new shekels to pay you. No, that's not a justification. If they present you with the invoice and the bill is due, you've got to pay them, period. Even if you can't pay them with the new shekels, pay them with the old shekels. Let's go on to the Gemara. So, v'lo nimtza hektish mischalal ala hektish, ketzer hu osa. What?
The NIS new Israeli shekels.
Yeah. So the Gemara's question is, you had said that what you're supposed to is take shekels, and then take the Ketoris and have the Kedusha of the Ketoris be transferred onto the shekels. The question is, but the shekels are already sanctified. How can you desanctify the Ketoris and transfer its Kedusha on something that already has sanctity? It doesn't work. You can only desanctify something by transferring its Kedusha onto Chulin coins, but not onto Hektish coins. So how does it work? So Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Bisna, Mevi Ma'os Umachalin ala Binyan. So the way it works is like this. The artisans who have been working on a construction project for the base, let's say they built a new wall, okay? That wall is not sanctified until it's actually constructed, and then we sanctify the wall. So how do we sanctify the wall? We take the shekels that are the payment, that are the value of payment for their work, and we take these shekels and we desanctify the shekels by transferring their kedusha on the completed wall. So now these shekels from the Trumas Halishka are desanctified, and then umevi ketores umachalal aleihen, and then you take the ketores and desanctify the ketores by transferring their kedusha onto these desanctified coins, and then v'nostenosal umnin bischarn, and then you give the desanctified ketores to the artisans for their wages.
But the process of sanctifying is just thinking or saying.
You make a declaration of kedusha,
saying.
But once something is hektish, if you need to desanctify it, you have to do something called a chilul. You have to transfer the kedusha from one item to another. Well, yes, but there has to be another item that the kedusha can pass on to. You can't fly off automatically. Yeah. Right. So now the Gemara says, Osan hamaos ma ye'ase bahem. So the Gemara now asks the question, okay, now that you've got the money now has acquired the sanctity of the Ketoris, what are you supposed to do with that money? This money now has the sanctity of Ketoris on it. The money that you had set aside for the shekels that you had set aside for the Kiddush, for the compensation for the Umnin, you transferred the sanctity of the Ketoris onto this money. Now what can you do with this money? So the Gemara now says, Rabbi Omer ani yinosein lebeis garmu lebeis avtinas shahayu bikim bepitam haketoris uv'maisa lechem apanim. So he says, here's what you should do. Use this money to compensate Beis Garmo and Beis Avtimas for their labor, and they'll take those coins and transfer the kedusha of those coins onto the products that they're manufacturing, which is the new ketoris and the new lechem apanim. And that way, that will de-sanctify the coins when it's in their possession, and that kedusha will be passed on to the items that need to be sanctified for the Beis Hamikdash avoda. Now, these two families, Beis Avtinas and Beis Garmo, were the two families that were in charge of manufacturing the Ketoris and the Lechem Hapanim. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Behein sheyihu chayavin lahen mos mishar rishona. But that's only provided that they were owed money from the previous year. Remember, you're taking the old coins that were from last year's Lishka, and you've taken the Kedusha of the Ketoris and passed it on to these coins. The only way that you can give it to Beis Garmo for their labor is if they were still owed money from the manufacturing of Ketoris and Lechem Aponim from the previous year. But if you're paying them in advance for the future of what they're going to be baking and manufacturing for after Rosh Chodesh Nisan, then that sanctified money has to come from the new Lishka, so that the sanctification of the new Ketoris and the new bread will be from this coming year. So it has to be clarified. Basically, he's saying that when you're compensating them for stuff that either is in the process or has already been manufactured from the previous year. And then you transfer the Kedusha of those coins onto the items that they've manufactured for the end of Adar, not for the beginning of Nisan. So Rabbi Chia bar Boi lo hayu chayavin lemos mishar rishona. So his question was, well, what if they've already been paid in full for all of the manufacturing from last year? Then what do you do with the money? These old shekels, the shekels that have that are from last year's shekels, that have the sanctity of the Ketoris, what are you supposed to do with them? So Asa Rebbe Ba, B'Shem Reb Chia, B'Shem Reb Yossi, Mekayitzin Bohenas HaMizbeach. The answer is that you use them for the Kitz HaMizbeach, you use them for karbanos when there's downtime on the altar. So Rebbe Ba, Bar Kohen Boi Kumi Reb Yossi, Mechalfe Shitzi, the Rebbe Chia Bar Ba. He says, I don't understand Reb Chia Bar Ba's logic. His logic is backwards. He says, Taman Srichalei, V'Kop Shitolei. Because previously he asked it as a question, can you use an item for the Kayetz HaMizbeach? And here it was so evident to him that it's so pasha to him that you could. Why is that? So let me explain to you according to the Vilna Gaon. He explains that what this line of the Gemara means is it's going back on the question that we had previously asked about flour that was sanctified in a Kli Shares. What about the flour that's above the Kli, that never made it into the Kli Shares? And there, Rabbi Chia Bar Ba had asked the question, does that flour get sanctified or not? And he left it as a question until we answered the question. We said, yes, it is sanctified, right? But why then over here is it so and sanctified to the point where you can use the surplus flour as proceeds for the purchase of animals for the Kitz HaMizbeach? And yet over here, he didn't ask it as a question. He just assumed straight out that any surplus monies that are from the Kedusha of Ketoris on them can surely be used for the Kitz HaMizbeach. And why is the question is, the logic is just backwards. He says in the previous case, even though the flour may be overflowing over the top of the walls of the Kli Shares, but at least they're part of something that was inside a Kli Shares. Here, the Ketoris may never have even come into a Kli Shares to begin with. And yet it's so obvious to you that you can use it for the Kitz HaMizbeach. So Hadit Tzrichale B'Kli Shares, he says, that when he had the question, he was talking about goods that at least a part of those flour particles were inside a Kli Shares. And Hadab Shitale B'Kitz LaMizbeach, and he says, but over here, it's obvious to him that it's going for the Kitz HaMizbeach, even though the Ketoris may not have necessarily ever entered into a Kli Shares in the first place. The Ispalgin, because this is in essence a machlokes, says the Gemara, that pitma b'chulin. What if a person manufactures the Ketoris in a vessel that is not one of the Klei Shares, that is not one of the ministering vessels, that's a non-sanctified vessel? So Rabbi Yossi Bey Rabbi Chanina Omar Pesula, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omar Keshera. That Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina says that it's puzzle, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that it's kosher. So basically, it would seem that the reason why we're puzzled by Reb Chia Bar Ba's statement that the Ketores sanctified coins can be used for the Kayetz HaMizbeach, it's problematic according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because maybe that Ketores never was sanctified in a Kli Sharis at all. And so what right do we have to say that it can automatically be used for the Kayetz HaMizbeach, even though it doesn't have that initial sanctity? So this is the machlokes. So the machlokes is that one opinion says that from the very moment of manufacture of the incense, it needs to be manufactured in ministering vessels in order for that Ketores to be kosher. The other opinion is no, that you can sanctify it post-manufacturing stage. You sanctify it even as a finished product. So ma time of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. What's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina's reason for saying that the Ketores is puzzle? Because Kodeshu, the Torah says that it shall be holy. Shetei havyasa b'kodesh, which teaches me that its very manufacturing has to be done in a state of holiness in a Kli Sharis. Ma time of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kodesh he shetehei ba'a mitrumas halishka. He looks at the pasuk that says Kodeshi, that it should be sanctified, which tells me that as long as it's used with, it's purchased with coins that are holy, then that in itself sanctifies it. It doesn't need to be sanctified from its point of manufacture. It can be sanctified after it's manufactured, as long as the proceeds that are used to purchase this incense comes from holy coins, from the Trumas Alishka. So Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Bon, asked the Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina Kishmuel, or the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Rabbi Yochanan. This machlokes between Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi as to whether the Ketores needs to be manufactured in a Kli Sharis or not is a similar machlokes we have between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. The Taninan, as we learned in a Braisa, Hamakdish Nechasav v'hayu bahen dvarim ru'uyin lekarbanos tzibor. If a person sanctifies all of his assets, and included in his assets are certain materials that are only usable for community sacrificial purposes. Now, that's a line from the Braisa. The question is, what kind of item is only usable for a community korban? It can't be an animal, because animals can be used for both karbanos yachid and karbanos tzivor. It can't be nesachim, because that could also be used for a yachid and a tzivor. So the question is, what kind of material can only be used for a korban tzibur and not for a korban yachid? So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ketores. Rabbi Yochanan says the Ketores, even though the Ketores is not a korban per se, but it's used for sacrificial purposes, and it's offered on behalf of the entire Jewish community, and it's not offered by an individual. So that's what we mean, that an individual is makdish his assets, and part of those assets are the Ketores. Now what do you see from here? You see that according to Rabbi Yochanan, Ketores can come from a non-sanctified source. As long as it's sanctified later in its post-manufacturing stage, it's still kosher for the Ketores, because after all, this person was makdish his assets after the Ketores was already manufactured. So you see, it can be manufactured in a chulin vessel and still be kosher. So Amar Rabbi Hoshea says, well, how is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi going to learn that brisa? Tiftor bu'uman mishol beis avtinos shahyanotel bischaro ketores. That the other opinion would have to say that the only way the ketores can be considered coming from an individual's estate is in the following scenario: that the base. Remember, we learned before that the Beis Hamikdash provides money that has the kedusha of Ketores on it, and they provide it to the house of Avtinas in order for them to manufacture the Ketores, so that the kedusha from those coins will be transferred on the Ketores that they're manufacturing. So basically, what the only way to understand how can an individual be makdish something that can only be used as Ketores, we're talking about a case where he was makdish before he had a chance to transfer I think this is the way the Korban Ha'ida learns, that like the Korban Ha'ida says, Shahayanotel bischaro moser haketor sheni tosar, el shahilokhin mimenu achar kach v'lo hispiku likach ad shehukdasha. That they were going to use this money to purchase the materials that they needed for the Ketores, And before they did that, a guy went ahead and sanctified all of his assets, including those monies that were set aside that already had the sanctity of the Ketores on them. So since that money was sanctified for the temple and it can only be used for the Ketores, that's what the Bryce is talking about. But in reality, according to the other opinion, you would have to, in the course of manufacturing the new Ketores, sanctify it in a Kli Shares. So that's the way you'd have to explain the Bryce according to that other opinion. Now the Gemara says the Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Chananya kishmol, but Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chananya, who says that it doesn't have to be, that it has to be dafka sanctified in a when it's manufactured in a Kli Shares, he holds like Shmuel. The Amar Rav Huna b'shem Shmuel machteshes asu osa ke Kli Shares lakodesh, that the machteshes, the mortar, I think it's called, right? Mm-hmm. The mortar that is being used to crush the ketores has to be sanctified as a Kli Shares. Because you see very clearly, according to Shmuel, that in the process of manufacturing, it has to be manufactured in a Kli Shares. Amar Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Bon, Amar Rabbi Chuna kumi Rabbi Yossi, Davar shekadosh b'Kli Shares nifta. So he says a very interesting statement. Something that's been sanctified to be used for sacrificial purposes in a Kli Shares, like, let's say, the Ketores, or any other, or like any kind of mincha, a libation, and so forth, if it's for communal purposes, it is subject to pidyon. It can be redeemed by having its kedusha pass on to coinage. So Amar lei v'lo dishmulhi. So I'm sorry, excuse me. This is a question. He asks the question: how can it be davar shekadosh b'chli shares nifta? If you're telling me that the ketores must be prepared in a Kli Shares, then how can we desanctify something that has been sanctified in a Kli Shares? Remember, we learned that there are two types of kedusha. There's kedushas haguf and there's kedushas damim. Kedushas damim, which is a monetary sanctification, is subject to desanctification by having its monetary holy status transferred onto another item. But if something has the higher kedushas haguf, which is intrinsic kedusha because it's of a higher level of kedusha that is intrinsic, that inheres in the object itself, how can you desanctify that object just by transferring its kedusha onto another item? That's not something that is subject to pidyon. And if something has kedushas haguf by being sanctified in a Kli Shares, such as the ketores, how can you desanctify it so easily by transferring its kedusha onto another monetary instrument? So Amar lei v'lo dishmulhi, the Shmuel Amar kalhu b'mosar. That the answer is that this goes according to Shmuel, who's the person that we're dealing with. Shmuel holds that the ketores has to be manufactured in a Kli Shares, is also the same Shmuel who says that when it comes to communal things that are sanctified in a Kli Shares, they can be desanctified. The ispalgin, because there is such a machlokes, hosiru temimim, that in the following case, at the end of Adar, there are always going to be leftover animals that were purchased with last year's shkalim. They always have backup animals. And so those animals that were supposed to be used for karbanos from last year, since they were purchased with last year's shkalim, they have sanctity, but they can't be used for the next year's. So what are you supposed to do with these animals? So Shmuel Omar niftin kisamimim. Shmuel just says, very simply, just desanctify them by transferring their kedusha onto money. And that way you'll be able to use these animals by resanctifying them with the New Year's shkalim. Now, normally you can't do that. Once an animal has been designated as a korban, it has kedusha saguf, and the only way to desanctify it is by letting it graze until it develops a mum, and only then can you desanctify it. But Shmuel says that there's a special law that applies with community funds, that even if a communally owned animal, even when it has kedusha saguf, it is subject to desanctification. The Rabbi Yochanan Amar niftin kipsule hamukdashim, and Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says no, that you have to let it graze just like any other animal that can no longer be used for its designated purpose, but it doesn't have a mum. You have to let it graze until it develops a mum, and only then can you desanctify it. Hosiru seirim, and similarly, if there are leftover goats, because sometimes there were goats that were purchased. Up until now, we're talking about sheep. Let's say you have leftover goats from last year, which are used as a korban chatas for, let's say, a Rosh Chodesh Musaf. So al daite di Shmuel im ola niftes l'kol sheken chatas. So just like Shmuel says that an ola can be desanctified in its pure state, so can a chatas be desanctified as well. And al daite di Rabbi Yochanan amar Reb Ze'era yiru. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, just like the ola has to be desanctified only after developing a mum from grazing, so too you have to do the same thing by the chatas. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, mekaitzin bahen es hamizbeach. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak says that it is okay if you have a leftover goat and you no longer need that goat for the korban chatas from last year. What you can do is you can just bring it, instead of desanctifying it, just bring it as for the kaitz hamizbeach. Just bring it as a voluntary korban ola for when there's downtime on the altar. That's the simplest solution. So, frek the Gemara v'kasha yesh chatas shekreva ola. How can you take something that was designated as a chatas and bring it now as a korban ola, olas nedava? Amar Rabbi Yossi shanyahi she'in karbonos tzibur nikvon ela b'shchita. Rabbi Yossi answers and he says very simply, because when it came to community-owned animal karbonos, their final sanctity was only attached to them moments before their shechita. So when you set aside this goat and you said this is a communally owned goat, you did not designate it as a chatas until right before the shechita. And since this is left over, you can bring it as a korban ola, because it was never identified as such as a chatas at this point. Amar Rabbi Chia Tanai Beistin Hu Alamoser Sheyikarvu Olos. He has a slightly different answer, Rabbi Chia. He says no. Even if they designated it as this is the chatas for Rosh Chodesh and they ended up not using it, nevertheless, one of the things that Beistin has the ability to do is to say that it's all tentative, it's all conditional, that this is a tentative chatas for Rosh Chodesh, but if we end up not needing it, then it'll automatically not have the sanctity of a chatas and we'll be able to bring it as an ola. You all have a wonderful day.